Today's founder is John Alsop. Now, I want to take a quick note before we talk too much about Alsop and say I put a lot of research into this man, and there is a question that I ran into of whether or not he was a loyalist. And it's interesting because the only place I find him being called a loyalist is in the Columbia printing of the Alexander Hamilton letters. Everywhere else, he's never listed as a loyalist. Now, I did put this out there, and I was talking publicly with JL Bell on Twitter, who brought to my attention the idea that sometimes people were referred to as loyalists, even if they didn't go out and fight as loyalists or actually side with the British. If you simply stepped away from the revolution, then you were a loyalist in some people's minds. Now, I don't think that's fair, especially for John Alsop. So let's talk about his life. Now, he was a wealthy New York merchant who came from a fairly middling family, but he and his brother had started a merchant firm and became very successful. And by the time the 1770s roll around, John Alsop is one of the most outspoken people in New York City about British taxation. As things become heating up, he gets appointed to the Committee of Correspondence in New York, an extremely important position at the time, and he joins the Committee of 60, which was one of the revolutionary governments that were taking over the Revolutionary War as things go down. Now, he ends up standing out so much as a leader that he is actually chosen by New York to go to the First Continental Congress. And while at the First Continental Congress, he signs the Continental Association, which is the boycott on British goods and the result of the First Continental Congress. Now, he is looked at as such an important member of the First Continental Congress that when he returns 6 months later to the Second Continental Congress, he is signed up as part of the Secret Committee. Now, the Secret Committee, I'll remind you, was made up of a bunch of people from the Second Continental Congress who were supposed to negotiate with foreign countries to get supplies for the American Revolution and just to get support in general. Famously, Ben Franklin is a member of the Secret Committee. He is the one who sends Silas Deane over as the first envoy to France to try and buy supplies from the French. Whether or not the French government acknowledges it, at least get some supplies from French merchants, with the French government, at the very least, looking the other way. And they successfully do this. It's also the Secret Committee that ends up sending Benjamin Franklin himself to France. They're also the ones who end up sending John Adams to Europe as well. John Alsop is one of the inaugural members of the Secret Committee. It is arguably the most important committee of the Continental Congress. Now, when they send Silas Deane over, well, he's under the guise of a merchant, not only practicing his own merchant, but working as an agent for another firm. And that firm is called Messrs. Alsop and Company. MESSRS, period. I think it's Misters, but I think you pronounce it Misters, but Misters Alsop and Company. Aesop and Company. I don't know why I call him Alsop. It was a joke I put in my head and I keep saying it. Anyway, the name of the fake company that was used as a disguise for the Americans to go to France in secret and buy supplies was put under John Aesop's name. He was the de facto president of this fake company that the Patriot Cause was using to get supplies from international friends. He's not just another guy at the Second Continental Congress. He's an extremely important asset to funding the war itself. Now, why, you ask, do people consider him a loyalist? Well, as I said, most people don't. It's just in the footnotes of the Columbia printing of the Alexander Hamilton papers, which I'm not very happy about, because John Alsop is in the Continental Congress when the vote for independence takes place. Now, on July 2nd, 1776, when the vote for independence is had, New York abstains because they are still waiting for further instructions from their home state. The delegates, as I have mentioned 100 times in this channel, the delegates of the Continental Congress thought their states were more important than the Continental Congress itself. And therefore, they did not do anything unless they were specifically instructed by their states to do so. In fact, the vote on independence itself had already been pushed back, while other colonies at this point waited further instructions. New York abstains from voting on July 2nd with the rest of the Continental Congress because they had not received further instructions. Now, when New York did get those instructions, just days later, New York does vote for independence. John Alsop does not. He, like several other people, notably John Dickinson, thought it was preemptive to make this decision. There was no government in place to take over. You were throwing off the most powerful nation in the world. It was good to be British. And John Alsop decides to resign his position in the Continental Congress instead of vote for independence. He's there for the vote in independence. He knows there's going to be independence. He thinks he's better served going back home. And he does. He resigns and goes back home. And though he does participate in raising some more money and troops for the cause, because he didn't vote for independence, because he didn't vote against it, he just resigned instead, he is now a questionable character in many people's minds. And certain people at the time may have referred to him as a loyalist. But if he was really a loyalist, like other members of the First Continental Congress from New York, Isaac Lowe, a member of the First Continental Congress, ends up being a loyalist and going back to New York City once the British take over. John Alsop doesn't go to New York City for the protection of the British. Instead, his house in Queens is burned down by the British, and then his house in New York City is taken by the British, and he goes to live with friends and family in Middletown, Connecticut. And he spends the duration of the war in Connecticut under the protection of the Patriots, not the protection of the British. And then, once the British evacuate at the end of the war and leave forever, then John Alsop returns to New York City and is almost immediately elected president of the Chamber of Commerce. He's already getting up there in age, but in the mid-1780s, his daughter Mary actually marries Rufus King, another extremely important Federalist. Later would be the last Federalist candidate for President of the United States. Again, Rufus King probably wouldn't be marrying into a Loyalist family if he wants to advance his career as a New York City merchant, especially because Rufus King was originally from Massachusetts, so he just got to New York. He's trying to make his name there. I point most of this out to demonstrate, and one last thing to demonstrate that he was not a Loyalist. When he passes away in 1794, he's actually looked at fondly by many people. In fact, I read a letter from John Adams. I can't remember who he was writing to, but John Adams had said, "We've lost so many of our original worthies." And he lists the names of people who died in the early 1790s who were worthies of the revolution. And John Alsop is one of those people that John Adams had met at the First and Second Continental Congress, that John Adams worked with on the secret committee to establish the trains and routes of getting supplies from Europe to the Continental Army. I may have gone on a little tangent. For such an obscure founder, I usually don't go this deep on them, but I was so disappointed by the treatment of John Alsop being casually named a Loyalist that I really kind of made it my mission today and this week when I published this article to verify that no, John Alsop was an important American revolutionary who simply did not think it was time for independence. Again, other names like John Dickinson has overcome the voting against independence, or not even voting against, abstaining from the vote on independence, or resigning instead of voting on independence. John Alsop apparently hasn't overcome that because he's not nearly as famous a founder. But thank you for watching this video, and thank you for agreeing with me that this man was not a Loyalist. Anyway, definitely hit like and subscribe, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments.